Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Champaign Public Library and to the award ceremony for our 5th annual short story contest. My name is Salem. I coordinate the Writers Workshop series and annual contest here at the library, and I will be serving as your host this evening. This year, we received close to 24 community-submitted stories, and tonight, we'll listen to the top 3 stories and find out who will take home the grand prize for Best Short Story this year. We'll also hear live feedback from this year's judges, who I'd like to now introduce. So, Kallan Buss is the lead bookseller and general manager of the Literary Book Bar in downtown Champaign. Kallan has years of hospitality experience, which shows in her work at the Literary, where she aims to create a welcoming and safe space for anyone and everyone in town. In her role as general manager, she works with groups such as UIUC's English Department, Women in STEM, and coordinates book clubs with local nonprofits. In her youth, her work was selected by the Theater and Interpretation Center at Northwestern University to perform on a stage production. Her greatest passions are getting involved in the community, a great glass of Barolo, and her 2 cats. Maisie Sparks is the editorial director of the Sparks Group, a marketing communication firm she formed nearly 30 years ago. She is also the author of 151 Things God Can't Do, Holy Shakespeare, 101 Scriptures that appear in Shakespeare's plays, poems, and sonnets, and the holiday devotional Christmas Quiet. Maisie is a journalism graduate of the University of Illinois and a frequent contributor to the Christian Science Monitor. Please help me welcome our judges. So, without further ado, let's find out who the winning stories are this year. So, in 3rd place, winning a 1-year subscription to Writer's Digest magazine and their story published on the library's website, is the story Faces by Simon Johnson. Simon will now read his story, followed by feedback from our judges.
Okay, story. Contrary to popular belief, creatures of a more supernatural persuasion do, in fact, exist. They have, in fact, existed through the extent of recorded history and beyond. Casey was one such creature, though you wouldn't have known as much from a cursory glance nor a prolonged staring contest. Casey was a shapeshifter who wanted to just live a normal, mundane life, and for the past 7 years he had been able to do so, until today. Today was the day that his past was going to come back to bite him in the rear again. You see, Casey hadn't always been Casey, which came with the territory of being a shifter. Eventually, you would have to assume a new identity, move on to another town, find a new face, a new name, start all over again. Most shifters lived nomadic lives as a result and could conjure up new faces on the fly. Casey was not most shifters. Casey didn't want to drift around, and unfortunately, Casey was the only shifter he had ever heard of that didn't have the inherent ability to make up a new face. He had to steal people's faces, so to speak. Not that he literally took their face away from them, just that he kind of assumed it. Then he would go a few towns or states away, somewhere that face could be untethered, where he could cook himself up some new, normal, mundane life. Even though it sounded easy on paper, it never really was easy in practice. Casey hated leaving behind families, friends, jobs. Hell, he even hated having to give up a particularly stunning view. However, they weren't all winners. His last life, for example, was something he was all too eager to escape from. Though he was convinced he had jumped enough towns away to not be recognized, he ran into a few old acquaintances of the man whose face he had stolen. Turns out he had accidentally slipped into the life of a cattle rustler, apparently a notorious one, notorious enough that to have a bounty on his head, a bounty that people were very much wanted to hunt. One such bounty hunter had found him, and after narrowly escaping with his life, the only face Casey could conjure was the face he had last seen, the bounty hunter's own. That was the moment that Casey began to exist, this time multiple states across. It had been 7 years since then, and his past hadn't caught up to him in that time. Truth be told, this lifetime as Casey had become one of the rare lifetimes where he started to forget that it wasn't his face, that it wasn't truly his life. He'd found his way into running the general store in the town where he had landed. He found a nice girl to settle down with. He was happy. He was Casey. When headed for the post office, leaving the general store in the care of a young lad who often helped to stock the shelves, he wasn't expecting to have the foundations of his very identity shaken. But those foundations were shaken. His head was sent into a tailspin when he saw the bounty hunter, the same man he had stolen his face from, walk into town. In a small stroke of luck, he had seen the bounty hunter, but the bounty hunter hadn't seen him. Casey's first instinct was that of self-preservation, aka abandoning this, his umpteenth life. Both cowardice and an attachment to this life that he had carved out for himself stayed his hand. For now. So he pushed that urge to run away to the side and thought about his next best plan. He returned to his store, thanked the young lad who had watched over the place, and sent him on his way with a few dollars in hand. It was sometime in the afternoon. Business was far from dying down for the day, but Casey had no intention of leaving the store open any longer. These four walls were going to be his refuge from his past. There were two customers left in the store, both of which were shepherded out of the building with promises of a discount if they came back tomorrow. Right as he was about to close the door, already reaching for his keys to lock the place up, another would-be customer came along. Aside from the initial annoyance that about the store being closed for business, he seemed to have something else on his mind entirely. Now, Casey, help me understand. What in the world is going on? The customer's brow furrowed as he spoke, a look of pure and utter mystery. I beg your pardon, Casey responded. You were just over there at the sheriff's, and you were kind of rude to me. I'm sure I have no idea what your... Casey was cut off midway through. And you weren't wearing that. Did you change? What's going on? Hey, do you have the thing? The customer was now cut off too, as Casey slammed the door shut and locked it in a hurry. He went about the store, flipping over the open signs that hung on just about every window to their closed counterparts. The shapeshifter was left with nothing but the inventory of his shop to listen as he sank down behind the counter and rambled to himself. From the moment the bounty hunter had set foot in town, he started getting these funny looks. The looks continued as he unloaded the bound man from the back of his horse and strong-armed him into the sheriff's office. One of the deputies saw to the process of locking the man up in a cell, while the sheriff himself pulled his attention from the book he had previously been engrossed in. He had been kind of present in the preceding moments and was able to soon gather that it was time for him to render payment. Of course, he sought to first set eyes on whoever delivered the state's latest charge into his care, expecting to see some stranger. An out-of-towner just here to earn some coin. Bounty hunters didn't tend to always be local, so imagine the sheriff's surprise when the man who was standing before him looked just like the man who sold him all his groceries. Casey, that you? Bewilderment had already set itself upon the sheriff. Casey who? The hunter asked for clarification. Casey you, my man. You're the guy who runs the general store, right? Why are you turning in bounties suddenly? Sheriff, I promise you I have no idea who or what you are talking about. My name is Reese, and anybody calling me Casey. This time he offered a clarification, rather than asking for it. Is that damn right? The sheriff trailed off, an incredulous look on his face as he kept eye contact with not Casey. He didn't even need to look as he counted out the allotted bounty due to the supposed Reese. It was a decent little pile of money when it was eventually nudged across the desk. Crazy world we live in. You look just like the fella, to a T. He shook his head, both amused and still half disbelieving. Yep, I'm sure it's a mystery. Dry and unamused, Reese gathered the money and thumbed through it to verify that it had been paid in full. There was a slight pause before he secreted the money away into his jacket, but it wasn't due to the money being wrong. It was mainly the fact that he couldn't stop pondering the sincerity and conviction with which the sheriff had mistaken his identity. The thought wasn't deep enough to have taken him under, though. After that momentary pause, business went about as usual, which is to say, the bounty hunter exited the station with a complete lack of cordial farewell. He was here for money, not niceties. It was quite unfortunate that a stranger beckoned to him the moment he set foot onto the street outside, set upon those unwanted niceties. Well, hey there, Casey. I was just about to come over to your shop to pick up the thing. The thing? The stranger leaned in close to emphasize, his voice dropping to a low and conspiratorial whisper. I promise you I have no idea who or what you are talking about. For some reason, Reese parroted the quiet and clandestine tone. He then straightened up and made it very clear that he didn't want to engage with the man any longer by beginning to turn away. Nah, come on, I know your face. The stranger was cut off with a speed and ferocity he was entirely unprepared for. I am not Casey. Now leave me alone for goodness sake. With that, he stormed off, hoping that would be the last he would hear of it. Of course, it wasn't. Far from it. Every single person he interacted with, from the barkeeper and every patron at the saloon, to the hotel clerk, and even the town drunk, all of them kept greeting him with a familiarity and a name that had previously been alien to him but was now utterly infuriating. He had tried to go about his business as he was wont to do, but with every turn he was being confronted with this continued case of mistaken identity. It was gnawing away at the inside of his skull, and frustration is what led him to seek out this Casey. The general store was easy enough to find, since it bore that same name that was driving him crazy. The store looked very closed, both metaphorically and literally, thanks to the signs that hung about the place. He tried the front door, but it was locked. He tried to peer through the windows, but couldn't make out more than shadows. He rounded the outside of the building and intended to try the back door. But he didn't get the chance to try, because the back door was already opening, with a man slinking his way out of the building. It was dark back there. The sun was hanging in the sky in the front of the building, casting a large, oppressive shadow behind the place. Even still, he could see the silhouette of the man emerge from the store, and the itch in his skull refused to let him just walk away. "Now hold up there, partner," he called out, and the figure was obviously startled. For a few steps, silence filled the air between them before the figure called back to him. "I've got places to be." Casey began to move away from the approaching Reese, leaving the door wide open behind him, his fingertips turning white with how desperately he was gripping his keyring. "Ah, come on now, Casey." Reese threw the name out there, and the way that the escaping figure paused mid-step upon hearing it confirmed exactly who he was. Reese sped up, and his quick approach made Casey attempt to leave once more. The shifter tried to break out into a sprint, but the pause had been just long enough for Reese to catch up before he could get too far. After a few frantic steps, Casey was about to round the corner, but instead found his momentum being turned around forcibly. Reese yanked Casey until he was facing him. Both stood at the very corner of the building. The shadow which they had both previously been enshrouded in now only fell upon Reese. Casey was bathed in the light that slipped between the general store and the building next to it. There weren't any words that could do justice to the shock that Reese felt. All he'd been expecting was someone who could maybe be mistaken for him from the right angle on the right day. What he hadn't been expecting was the face that stared back at him, being so identical to his own that he may as well have been looking in a mirror. Even the birthmark that sat under Reese's left eye was sat there beneath Casey's own left eye. The bounty hunter opened his mouth, but no words came out, partly because he couldn't squeeze them past the strangling lump that sat in his throat, and partly because of the sucker punch that connected with his jaw. Casey had slipped the keyring around his hand, with all manner of keys jutting out to and fro like a makeshift claw. Every piece of metal that contacted Reese's jaw was sharp and unrelenting. The blow was enough to send Reese stumbling back, his footing failing as he fell down to his rear. Casey took his chance and successfully disappeared around the corner this time. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds before Reese was able to drag himself back to his feet and around the corner in pursuit, jaw still thrumming with pain. Blood had already begun to ooze from the wounds on his face, staining his clothes as it trickled down. The bounty hunter was left standing there, bleeding, his mind almost feeling like it was trying to twist into itself. The only thing he could see was a discarded apron which bore the same signage as the front of the store. He pushed on to exit the alley between the two buildings, and no matter how many times his head swiveled from left to right once out in the street, there was no sign of his identical assailant. From that day forward, Reese would become fixated on the man who wore his face, at least for a while. Months would turn into years, and eventually he would begin to doubt even his own recollection of events. Every person who heard his story would doubt him at every turn, and that wore the hunter down. Maybe he was just crazy. Even so, his jaw would continue to ache whenever he beheld himself in a mirror. Casey, meanwhile, was no more. The shapeshifter had managed to escape by the skin of his teeth yet again, and he was forced to kiss goodbye to that normal, mundane life. He left town, abandoning everything from his land to his love. At some point, he would return to that same town, a few lifetimes later, when Casey was but a single piece of the puzzle that was his unnaturally long lives. That time around, the town wouldn't capture him quite the same. He didn't find the same happiness, just an ache in his heart and reminders of what could have been. Thank you.
Sure. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I thought that was a really cool story. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought, sorry, my notes are on my phone, so if I look down, I apologize. I thought it was a wild ride. Oh, come on. Why is it being weird? Technology. I thought it was such a wild ride and a really cool concept to have a shapeshifter in Western times. I was like, oh, cool. Where are we going with this? So excited. I was very immersed all the way through. I loved the Western theme. I almost thought you could have played it up just a skosh more.
Yeah.
Just a skosh. Only because in the beginning half, when I initially was reading it, I was like, oh, where are we going with this? Is this modern day? Is it Western? Wasn't 100% sure. But then once we got into it, I was like, okay, I'm in. Like, let's see where this goes. Where's my horse?
Okay.
Like, I want to keep going, you know? I think the other small detail, these are very small things, because I thought would be really cool was to add in a little bit more about the shape-shifting abilities, only in the sense of my brain is, I have a very strategic brain, so I'm like, well, why can't he just shapeshift out of this situation? Why can't he take the face of somebody else? you know. But it was very small, nothing crazy.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the cat and mouse aspect between Reese and Casey. I thought that was really fun. And what did I write here?
Ask yourself the same thing.
You know, sometimes you never know. It's just a bunch of typos. I thought the Casey's, the back and forth between Reese finding out Casey and whatnot, I thought that was so cool. And I was really, really invested. But I don't know what I would do if I ran into somebody with my face.
Exactly.
That's kind of the thought, the overall theme. I was like, wow, how would I handle this situation?
Mm-hmm.
But overall, I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was a very fun ride. So congratulations.
Thank you.
My reflection and listening or reading your story, what I thought about was there's a saying that's attributed to a Chinese philosopher, and it says, no matter where you go, there you are. And that really came across for me in the story. That seemed to be the message, that we may be able to hide from others, but we certainly can't hide from our own selves.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that was the message that you were sending, but
It was meant to be, but it kind of got lost when I was through revisions and trying to make sure it fit in the word with it
Yeah.
and stuff. So,
yeah. So I found that kind of intriguing. There was a consistency for me in this arc of internal conflict, internal crisis, and then an internal and external resolution. And all of this was self-imposed, which many fears are. And I thought that's what Casey was trying to grapple with, his own fear of who he was. For that character, the fear of not wanting to be found out kept him from running, yet continually running into himself. And I questioned, like you, that why couldn't a supernatural being have the power to create another unique image? But I said to myself, it's because there are no supernatural beings, and people just wear the mask and many faces to hide the fact that they are not supernatural. I like this story because it addressed a human question. If I'm totally known, will I be totally loved? And instead of facing that fear, the main character just keeps running with an ache in his heart and reminders of what could have been. What would have happened if he had faced that fear? I don't know, and the story doesn't tell us, but was he willing to look at, but you were willing to look at that fear and create a story about it. So I like that. Another thing that stood out for me in the story was its descriptive words. I liked how you secreted the money away. Keys jutted out to and fro like a makeshift claw, a strangling lump that sat in his throat. I liked all of those phrases that were more showing me than telling me. Overall, I found it very interesting, with a message worth remembering. Don't be afraid to look yourself in the face.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Congratulations again, Simon.
Yes.
So moving on to our second place story. So in second place, also winning a 1-year subscription to Writer's Digest magazine and their story published on the library's website, is the story Jane by Yael Zairi. Reading the story Jane is local poet Jim O'Brien, followed again by feedback from our judges.
Hi there. Hear me okay? Yes, good, okay. Just one point, there's a few passages that reference military time. If you're not familiar with that, when you hear me say 1400, just know that's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Jane. I first met Jane on June 1st. She was one of 3 recruits sent to my unit. Usually, new recruits spend about 2 months in the small room, learning and immersing themselves with all the new material, information, and well, mostly math that was a prerequisite for moving on up to the big boys club, where we worked on intelligence and classified materials. The newbies who were usually sent over were well-groomed, 18 to 22-year-olds coming out of the gifted programs, most extremely brilliant. They were also somewhat detached and standoffish. Jane, on the other hand, was inquisitive and kind. I could see her eagerness to learn. On June 10th, we had our usual monthly group meeting, and Nathan, who acted as the newbie's full-time instructor, mentioned Jane stood out from the group. I took out her file and sat down to go through it, then printed out one advanced math riddle and headed toward the small room. I could have taken the car, but decided in favor of walking. I knew it was best to keep my body moving as much as possible, and by and large enjoyed the walk between the rooms. When I got there, I handed Jane the riddle. She was surprised but recovered quickly and allowed me to observe as she moved around numbers and found the right answer. I was impressed. The next day, I came carrying a real cryptography problem for her. I set it on her desk and she looked up at me. "A challenge," I said. "Accepted," she replied, a smile flickering across her face. It was by coincidence that I had to stop at the small room later that night to pick up a file and saw her still sitting at her desk alone. "Jane," I said, "what are you doing here? It's almost midnight." "I'm so close to solving it," she said tensely. I walked closer, then sat next to her. "Listen, this is important. One of the first rules of the big room is that you must take care of yourself. No one goes around and tells you that it's time to sleep or eat or do some physical activity. If you want to be good at this brain stuff, Jane, I think you already know that I believe you have potential. You must take care of your body, understood?" During the weeks that followed, I slowly became aware we were forming a habit. Every evening after dinner, I would stop by the small room and she would be there, working. I told myself, it is on the way to the office in any case. But what did she tell herself? I do not know. Is it possible she was waiting for me? "You're still working," I would call out. "I'm so close to finishing," she would always remark. And that was my cue to sit by her and suggest this and that. The dance we created was gentle and relaxed. No one around us. I enjoyed being the teacher, the mentor. She refined her role as time went by, asking sheepishly quiet but highly intelligent questions, smiling, blushing every time I commended her. I found myself waiting those 15 minutes until I stood up and excused myself, as I had to get back to my duties. On July 1st, I called Nathan to my office and asked for his opinion regarding Jane. Should we move her to the big room? Is she ready? He was all for it. We agreed on a trial period. That evening, I set off to the small room to find Jane. I found myself lingering in the hallway looking at her. She was hunched over her desk, a position we were all guilty of. Since I was sure she did not notice my presence, I allowed myself a detailed gaze at her. She was dressed informally, as were most of the civilian staff at the unit, blue jeans and a sweatshirt, sitting cross-legged on her chair. She changed her leg position every few minutes. Was she nervous? She lifted one hand and started biting her nails. It seemed intimate. Maybe I shouldn't be watching. "You're still working," I called out, playing out my role. She jumped up. Was she not anticipating my arrival? "I'm stuck." Her answer bewildered me. It was a different tone. It had a different tone to it. Sadness, angst, despair. I walked down and sat on the wooden chair next to her. "It happens," I said, stretching my left leg a bit. "I hate it," she shot back as she lifted her gaze. "What have you tried?" "What do you mean?" she said, her eyes fixed on me. "I mean, besides sitting at your desk for hours, what have you done differently to get unstuck?" "I never had to do anything differently," she said quietly. "The answer always comes up at the end." I paused for a second, then pushed the chair back and got up. "I'm pleased," I said. "I think this means we finally challenged you." She allowed a small smile to form on her face. During August and September, Jane finally found her stride. I found myself intrigued by any piece of information about her, her interests, hobby, childhood, Communication between us was not one-sided. I was less reserved around her, and though we had 9 years between us, our conversations soon became meaningful. One evening, I was working on a status report to headquarters when Jane came into the big room. She had spent hours lately working on asymmetrical encryptions. An hour passed before she got up and stood by me. "Shouldn't you go home?" she said. "I don't know if I'd call it home," I told her. Then, baffled by my candid outburst, I added, "I'll go soon." "You need a dog to call it a home," she replied as she sat down next to me. "I had a dog back home. He died right before I enlisted in the Marine Corps." "The Marines?" she asked, her voice high-pitched. "I enlisted the summer before my senior year in high school," I replied. "Always wanted to be a pilot." She nodded. "I served for 3 years and 32 days. Then, well, there was a training accident and I couldn't continue." Her eyes widened. "They wanted me to leave, but I resisted. So they tested me and allowed me to join the intelligence community." I allowed her to take on her first solo encryption around mid-September, and by October she was pulling her own weight. She joined a team assigned to innovation and process betterment and helped to identify new techniques and workflows. On November 17th, she asked to show me an idea she had for asymmetric encryptions. I never had seen a similar technique. It seemed like we struck gold. A few days later, I picked her up near her housing complex as we were headed to HQ to show some of the higher-ups her new method. We spent some time talking about the weather, the offering in the dining hall as of late, and more mundane chit-chat. "I was just wondering," she said suddenly, "about your leg." "That's the result of the training accident I told you about," I said. "It was a helicopter crash. My left leg was shattered to pieces. They managed to save it, but it's still..." "Very painful?" she interjected. "Mostly metal," I intended to say. I didn't speak about my injury often. The only people who knew about my daily struggles were the ones who asked, my doctor and physical therapist. Even my parents strayed away from the conversations about my leg. It happened. I rehabilitated. If I stay active, go to the gym or swim and walk every day, I'm usually fine, I concluded. No point in telling her more. I could feel her eyes on me. "I'm so happy you got out of there alive," she said softly. I felt my grasp on the wheel tighten. On the morning of the 15th of December, I was in my office when the phone rang. It was Jane, sounding weak. She told me she had a fever and apologized for not being able to come to a meeting we had scheduled. Around 1400, I took my car and drove to the main kitchen. I was sure they would give me some soup for Jane, although lunch hours were already over. When I got back to the car, I tried calling Jane, but she did not answer. "I'll just drop the soup and go," I told myself. As I climbed slowly up the stairs to her apartment, I hoped Jane wouldn't see my visit as intrusive. I knew a relationship with Jane was impossible. She was 22 and I was 31. I was her officer. It was wrong to even think of it. Nevertheless, here I was, standing outside her door with chicken soup, a walking cliche. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I touched the handle. The door was unlocked. I walked in. "Jane," I called out. "It's Officer Shane. I came to bring you some soup." I do not know what drove me to peek inside her room, but I did. She was lying in her bed, sleeping. "Jane," I whispered. Was she okay? I walked closer. She didn't look well. I touched her. The warmth of her body startled me. She was burning up. To my relief, she opened her eyes. "Jane, it's me, Officer Shane. I came to see if you're okay." "I am," she said. "It's just a fever." Her eyes closed tightly, and I could hear my heart beating faster. Perhaps I was reading the situation wrong. Is this an emergency? I wasn't convinced. She is conscious and breathing, I told myself. I went to the bathroom and returned with a wet cloth to put on her forehead. "Jane," I said, "I want you to drink some water." She nodded, then sat up, her face twitching. Was she in pain? "Where's your thermometer?" I asked. She pointed to her dresser, and I handed it to her. The thermometer tinged, revealing a temperature of 102.4 degrees. "We have to get your temperature down now," I said. "I'm taking all the blankets off you, and you have to change into something lighter." Did you take any Tylenol, I asked. An hour ago. I'll be fine, Officer Shane, she said faintly. You can go back. Thank you for coming to check on me. I'm not going anywhere, I replied, then opened her closet doors and found Jane didn't have many clothes, another similarity between us. I grabbed a short blue t-shirt and a pair of shorts and handed them to her. Jane started lifting herself off the bed, her movements slow, calculated. I'll step out for a second, I said, walking to the corridor. Suddenly I heard a large thud from her room. I raced in, finding her on the floor, her pants half on. I lost my balance. I'm fine, she said, her voice panicky. I came closer, intending to help her up. I immediately saw the wound on her inner thigh. The whole area was red and swollen, parts of it yellowy even. It took me a minute to see what was yet to be seen. Her entire right leg was crisscrossed with cuts and scars, some small and whitish, some larger or red. I looked up at her. Oh my God, I whispered. No, she cried, go away. I'm taking you to the ER, I said frantically. No, I can't go to the ER, she said, her voice breaking. What do you mean, I replied, trying to find Jane's gaze. She was looking down. I do it to myself, she said quietly. It's called cutting, self-harm. My breath stopped. I looked at Jane. She stood up, still unsteady, holding the bed. She finally managed to take off her long pajama pants and put on the shorts I gave her. I always use a sterile pad afterward, and I changed the blades, she spoke slowly. But I guess something went wrong this time. She sat on the bed. I have antibiotics in my medicine box, just in case. I should probably start using them. I was shocked by the day-to-day manner she was speaking in. Okay, I said cautiously. Let me know where the medicine box is, and we'll start from there. 2 hours later, her temperature was 101, and I was able to breathe again. How long has it been going on? I asked, as Jane opened the plastic box with the chicken soup I brought her. Since I was 14, she said. I was speechless, and my leg hurt. I've been sitting in a chair far too long. I got up and moved my foot around. I guess I just can't understand why. You are such a calculated person, so intelligent and reasonable. How can you hurt yourself this way? I sighed. While you were resting, I read some articles on the web, and I understand it's complicated, but Jesus, Jane, you were able to find a way to dramatically improve one of the most common processes in the unit in your first few months here. How have you not found a solution for this yet? I wasn't trying, she said, her eyes fixed on me. What about someone else, I asked, your brother, teachers, friends? I knew her parents were not a part of her life. I never told anyone, she admitted. It's so difficult to explain. Cutting, it's a way to feel better. It helps me deal with life. It's been with me for so long. I mean, I have tried to stop. I have, many times. But there's always a voice within me that says, why? Why should you let this go? It doesn't harm anyone. It harms you, Jane, I said harshly. How can I keep you in the unit now? Her mouth opened slightly, then grew silent. I understand, she said. Do what you have to do. The next day, December 16th, around noon, I knocked on her door. Thank you for yesterday, she said, as she let me in. I nodded. You're feeling better? I asked. Much better, she replied, smiling. I'm sorry for troubling you, Officer Shane. I really am. You have more important things to deal with. This is important, I wanted to tell her, as important as can be, but I was silent, my mind racing. I brought you some more soup, I said, handing her another plastic box. Thanks. I better go, I said. Group meeting starts in 30 minutes. I sat in my car in the parking lot beneath her apartment. My leg was bothering me again. I picked up my phone and searched for Jane's name in my contacts. Hi, Jane, I wrote. Wanted to let you know I walk daily from 2100 to 2200. Walking is part of my formula. Join me, Nick. Thank you.
Wow. Well, first of all, congratulations.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed this story. I thought it took over I don't even know how to describe it. My emotions kind of like took over in the situation because it hit home in a lot of ways. Firstly, when I first started reading, we'll just go through the reel of emotions that I had. It felt, I was like, okay, this is fun. Like, I enjoy reading like fun, quirky romance stories. Like, this is a great trope. I'm really enjoying it. And I really enjoyed the humility and the human interactions between Nick and Jane. I thought it was great. I thought it was well written, and I enjoyed how you were able to get a lot of information and key details and be able to keep the story flowing without it feeling too crammed. I thought that worked really well. I also thought that you handled the topic of self-harm very well, and I thought you brought a lot of light to that. I thought it was incredible. Despite everything, I really, really enjoyed how you were able to handle that situation and then turn it into something positive at the end. As, you know, we're human, we're struggling, and showcasing Jane's, especially when you were writing about how Nick was saying, how can you hurt yourself this way? And that he was researching and trying to figure it out, and she's like, I just do it. I think it showed that while she's an incredibly capable woman and challenging herself constantly, that she's struggling with her own pressures on herself. And that was huge. It hit really close. So I thought you captured that very well. Yeah, of course. I was a little confused about the big room and the small room. That was really it. I was like, didn't really know. I was like, oh, this feels kind of Squid Gamey, like which one's which? But other than that, let's see here. I really enjoyed the end of the story and how Nick wanted to be an ally and help create healthier habits for her. I thought that really was beautiful. And it turned something so heavily intense as self-harm and recovery from a traumatic injury into something like, hey, let's work on this together. Like, we can do it. Anyways, I might be looking surface level. I'm sure there's a lot more. But as just a reader, I really enjoyed it. So I thought you did a wonderful job.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Jane for me was one of those plots that I didn't see coming.
Yeah.
I thought I knew where it was going, but it surprised me, and a good story should do that. I thought this story was building up to an affair, to only discover that there was a troubled young woman who might just have met the person who could walk her out of her pain and secrecy into a deep and meaningful friendship, or maybe more. I usually don't like stories that leave me guessing at the end, but for Jane, I made an exception. I thought the setting was very interesting and different. Often a nation's classified facilities are for espionage and spy movies and international intrigue. Yet in this space that's designed for secrecy, I found human beings who were taking the risk to be vulnerable and grow in their ability to be transparent and reach out. I think the characters were very memorable. I saw their strengths and their weaknesses, and they made me care more than judge. I was inspired to see that a growing trust didn't end when the flaws were revealed, and I was drawn into the mystery of this relationship, hoping that reading this story would be worth it, and it was. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Congratulations, Yael. And finally, in first place, winning a one-on-one consultation with local author and editor Ekta Garg, a professional headshot for their author portfolio, and an annual membership to Masterclass for access to online writing courses, and their story published on the library's website, is the story The Dance of a Lifetime by Josh Loomis.
The Dance of a Lifetime. Can you tell me a story, Grandpa? Squeaked a voice. Grandpa looked at the source of the voice, snuggled up under the covers of her bed. He smiled at Annie, knowing full well he couldn't resist her big, curious eyes. I suppose I could tell you a story. What would you like to hear? Can you tell me about how you met Grandma? Annie, I don't think today is a good day for that story, said her mother from the corner of the room. It's all right, said Grandpa. I would love to tell you about how I met your grandmother. Annie nestled into her pillow, a grin spreading across her face that only Grandpa's stories could produce. It was 1944, and I had just enlisted in the Army. My buddies, John, David, George, and I, were set off to ship off the next morning to Europe. How old were you, Grandpa? I had just turned 18. You weren't allowed to enlist until then, and we all wanted to join up together. John convinced us that we needed one last night of dancing to help keep us alive over in Europe. I can still hear the Benny Goodman song blaring as we walked through the doors of that ballroom. The other guys were intent on dancing with as many girls as they could that night. But I had eyes for only one girl. Was it Grandma? Grandpa nodded. I can see her now, full of youth and energy, her blue eyes matching her dress. She had a smile that could pierce any man's heart. Her curly brown hair twirled at her shoulders alongside her dress. From the moment I saw her, I knew I had to dance with her. It took me half the night to muster up the courage, but when we finally danced, I knew that I had just met the girl of my dreams. What kind of dancing was it? Swing dancing was all the rage back in those days. That was when I still had the strength to swing Grandma around. I was shy, but once I had your grandmother in my arms, we danced the night away. Grandma had a way of getting lost in the moment, and for a brief second, I forgot that I was shipping off the next morning. Did you marry her right after you met her? Grandpa chuckled. It would be almost 2 years before I saw her again. But I had enough sense to ask Grandma if I could write to her before the night was over. She made me promise that I would return so that we could dance again. Memories flooded his mind, and for a moment he was back on the beaches of Normandy. Grandma's letters were what kept me sane while I was in France. The memory of her blue dress shimmering on the dance floor would always make me smile, no matter how cold or tired I was. In 1945, I vowed that if I ever made it back to the United States, I would marry her. Annie yawned. Did you do more dancing when you came back? We did more dancing, all right. I married your grandmother 3 months after I came back. I'll never forget holding your grandmother tight on the dance floor on our wedding day. George made fun of me because he said I couldn't see anything else in the room. But there was nothing else in the room worth seeing that day. Were John and David there as well? No. They never got to see my vow fulfilled, Grandpa said, a lump forming in his throat. After we were married, we went dancing as often as we could. Swing dancing, said Annie, her curiosity returning. We did some more swing dancing. Anytime we took the dance floor, all eyes would be on your grandmother, which was good for me because she was the better dancer between the two of us. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. When the 50s rolled around, the foxtrot was the new dance. We learned how to slow down our moves, which is a good thing, too. Why is that, Grandpa? Well, because Grandma was pregnant with your mother in 51. I couldn't really swing her around anymore once her belly began to show. Not to mention our whole lives slowed down once we had children. If we were still moving at the pace of swing dancing, we would have never had the patience to raise your mother. And then you may never have been born. But did you dance at all during that time, Grandpa? We danced whenever we could find the time. But between raising children and working long hours at the factory, we didn't have many opportunities to visit the ballroom. What kind of dancing was popular in those days? Annie asked, her big eyes shimmering. Oh, as soon as we had children, we lost touch with all the new types of dancing. I remember learning how to do the twist, but my knees couldn't handle all the movement. They weren't able to get all of the shrapnel out of my right knee, so it would ache after we spent the night dancing. It didn't bother me when I was in my 20s, but as I got older, my body began to plead with me to stop trying to keep up with the fast tempos. You never did any dancing at home? We dance in our living room all the time, Annie said. Grandpa chuckled, the image of dancing with Doris in their crowded 2-bedroom apartment coming back to him. When we moved to Chicago, the Latin couple who lived next door, Pedro and Juanita, taught us how to tango. After your mother went to sleep, we used to glide up and down our living room to help keep warm in the winters. We had to keep our record player quiet, and we could just barely hear it over the buzz of the radiator. Really? I didn't know that you learned how to tango, said Annie's mother. Oh, yes. It helped us keep the romance alive in those years. There's a reason you have 3 younger brothers, Mary. Dad, Annie's only 6 years old. Annie giggled innocently, laughing at her mother's reaction. Grandpa smiled, cherishing the memory. Did you teach Mom how to dance? Annie asked. I helped a little bit, but it was mostly your grandmother. When your mother was 2 years old, Grandma began to teach your mom every type of dance she knew. Grandma had always wanted to be a ballerina, but she never had the opportunity. So she was determined to teach your mom ballet. Why couldn't she be a ballerina? Well, she worked in a factory during the war instead of going to ballet school. Then when we got married, we knew we wanted to start a family. But Grandma's dream lived on through your mother. Did Mom love ballet as much as Grandma did? Your mom lived and breathed ballet for years. All she would talk about is pirouettes, chasse, and promenades. When she was your age, all she wanted to wear was leotards and pointe shoes. Mommy says that I'm not allowed to wear leotards in public, Annie said through a yawn. Your grandmother used to say that. I used to come home from work and your mom was twirling around our living room while Grandma gave her pointers. After your mom went off to college, Grandma didn't know what to do with herself. We were so busy with your uncle's sporting events that for a while we forgot to dance at all. There was less joy in those days. Annie's eyes widened at the very thought of forgetting to dance. But you did dance again, right? A fond smile crossed Grandpa's face. After your uncles all moved out of the house, we would go square dancing. We had moved out of Chicago, and there was square dancing every Friday night. You had to have 3 other couples to dance with you, so we ended up making some close friends. None of us were able to jump and twirl like we once could, but your grandmother and I could do-si-do with the best of them. Mary let out a chuckle as Annie's eyes slowly closed. They sat in silence as Annie's rhythmic breathing indicated that she had drifted off to sleep. Did you keep dancing towards the end? Mary whispered. When your mother got sick, she didn't have the energy to square dance. But she made me promise that I would dance with her every day until the end. We used to waltz in the kitchen, cherishing the memories of our youth. Doris used to tell everyone who visited her in the hospital the story of the nervous young lad who she prayed would ask her to dance back in '44. She never got tired of telling that story, and I never got sick of hearing her tell it. A lump began to form in Grandpa's throat. During her rounds of chemotherapy, I had to support her weight when we waltzed. We usually only made it through one song before we had to stop. But I kept my promise to her. Silence. Dad, I'm sorry that she asked today. During your eulogy, you mentioned that you and Mom met while dancing. Annie loves dance so much. She wanted to ask you about it. Grandpa smiled. You don't need to apologize. Annie loves dance as much as her grandmother and as much as her mother. We told her to wait until a few days after the funeral. I know how hard it must be to tell that story today. Tears began to slide down Grandpa's face. He stood and kissed his sleeping granddaughter's forehead. He looked at his daughter and saw that she also had tears in her eyes. Mary gave him a half smile, at a loss for words. Silently, she stood from her chair and embraced him in a hug. I miss her already, Mary said. Me too, Grandpa said. But I made her promise me that in the next life, we would dance together again.
Well, this story had me in tears. Congratulations, by the way, on your win.
Thank you.
Let me put my notes up. I loved how the story flowed, and I loved the dynamic between the granddaughter and the grandfather and the mother sort of chiming in. This story hit home very close as well, only because my grandparents used to dance in the kitchen constantly, and they had signs of like the foxtrot and all these things, and they used to teach me and my brother how to dance. So it was very reminiscent and kind of a nice warm feeling there. So it was awesome to follow along this story and see how it kind of progressed. I thought there was great setting and atmosphere, and it really helped me envision the story. It's one of those stories where, you know, when you're reading and you're kind of going through and you can see it playing in your head as a movie. That's kind of what I got. I also got slight like the Notebook movie vibes, which one of my favorite movies. So that was awesome. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was so colorful and vibrant, and I could see them waltzing in the kitchen. I could see them learning to tango and stuff, and I thought that was awesome, and it was so romantic. Yeah, that's where I was at with that. I have nothing but good things to say because I loved it, and I want to know what happens next. I want to know where Annie goes in her life, you know? So, congratulations.
Thank you.
Before I share, I just have a question. Is this based on reality?
It's not.
Oh, it's not.
Wow.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's based on my grandfather, but the characters are a little older than my grandparents. So
Okay.
Okay.
my grandfather fought in Vietnam, not World War II.
I
Okay.
see.
Cool.
Okay. So there wasn't your grandparents doing this dancing and this
No.
stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You almost convinced me, though.
It was very,
I was
yeah,
yes.
it was very
I
good.
I almost felt, oh, this person is writing about their own family. But I really enjoyed the story. I thought the characters were developed through the dialogue, the actions and the descriptions. There was plenty more show than tell, and by that I mean I was not only reading the story, I was seeing it. I was touched by how the curiosity of a child moved an older man, really, I think, from grief to joy. I think he was very happy to share what he was, his life story. And as I get older, I like to share mine, so I understand that. I find that it was a universal experience of how the innocence of a child can impact the mood of loving adults. I like the movement of how the telling of that story, I believe, moved him from grief to dancing, even though they were tears. They were tears that really were telling about happy time and missing that happy time. I was almost wishing, and I kind of wished that the grandfather had danced with the daughter at the end, but that might have made it a little syrupy sweet. So that's okay. That's okay. I think you gave the story a good sense of time and place. There was a war, there was a dance floor, there was a little girl's bedroom, and I could envision all of that. The writing brought me to those places without me being told I was there. Even though you didn't give a lot of descriptions about them, what was described and what was felt was the intimacy and the love that filled those spaces. I think that was evident. To be honest, I'm a sucker for a feel-good story, and I could feel the love of this story, the love that was passing down, that extended from the presence and would perhaps occupy a warm place in this little girl's heart. And so I really enjoyed it. Usually when I watch a film that I like, I watch it again and again, and this might be something I would read again and again. So thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations again, Josh. I want to once again congratulate our 3 winners, Simon, Yael, and Josh. Let's give them a round of applause. And some thanks are in order, so I want to give a big thank you to our judges this year, Kallan Buss and Maisie Sparks, for lending your time and expertise to our writers. And of course, a special thanks to Jim O'Brien, our guest reader tonight. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. Please stick around for refreshments and to once again congratulate our winners. So thank you for coming.